Mesdames, Messieurs, soyez les bienvenus. C'est avec un immense honneur que je me tiens devant vous aujourd'hui, entourée de femmes magnifiques qui ont dédié leur vie à la gouvernance, au leadership et à la transformation de nos sociétés. Mesdames, je suis honorée de partager cette tribune avec vous aujourd'hui. Je suis Hind Moutawakil, présidente de Super H, Business School à Casablanca, et j'aurai le plaisir de modérer cette très belle discussion, ce très beau panel, autour d'une thématique qui, il faut le dire, revêt une importance particulière pour le Maroc et pour toutes les nations souveraines d'Afrique. Gouvernance et leadership, la femme motrice de développement et de changement. Mesdames, Messieurs, il est vrai que l'Afrique a connu une intensification des conflits sur les dernières décennies, je dirais même une superposition des défis économiques, géopolitiques, sociaux et sociétaux qui fragilisent le vivre ensemble. Et il sera vital pour nos sociétés de saisir ces opportunités justement pour contribuer au développement économique de notre continent. Les femmes sont encore trop absentes. Elles sont trop absentes des processus décisionnels, sous-représentées dans les domaines de la gouvernance et du leadership, trop peu insérées sur le marché du travail formel. Et pourtant, constituent l'un de ces espoirs pour une Afrique locomotive du développement. Vous l'aurez compris, l'objectif principal de cette session sera de définir ensemble ces enjeux qui s'adressent à notre continent, tout en explorant justement toutes les opportunités qui peuvent émerger grâce à la mise en place et à la mise en œuvre de stratégies d'empowerment, de politiques inclusives. Et il me semble également crucial de discuter et de proposer des mécanismes qui seraient de nature non seulement à encourager la réussite de ces femmes, les réussites individuelles de ces femmes que j'aurai le plaisir de vous présenter, mais également qui devraient être de nature à induire un changement global au sein de l'ensemble des organisations structurelles et sociétales. Nous allons ensemble explorer les liens essentiels entre impact des femmes dans la transformation de nos sociétés, entre gouvernance, entre leadership, entre la consolidation d'un leadership féminin inclusif qui me paraissent absolument essentiel à un développement égalitaire à l'échelle planétaire. Nous allons également partager, on le promet, des idées inspirantes. Et surtout, je voudrais qu'on célèbre ensemble la réussite de ces femmes. Vous savez, on a déjà commencé le panel. Nous, on a commencé ce panel il y a une trentaine de minutes. Vous allez voir, elles sont absolument superbes. J'ai eu beaucoup de plaisir à échanger avec elles. Et je voudrais vous présenter, sous vos applaudissements s'il vous plaît, Irène Ochem, Bémisola Aboudou, Fumi Adepojou, Mérissa Kurma et Hajar Yacoubi. Mesdames, soyez les bienvenues. Et je me tourne vers vous, Bémisolo. Il est vrai que ces questions de mixité, même si ce n'est pas le seul sujet aujourd'hui, mais ces questions de mixité, notamment par exemple dans les conseils d'administration, ont renouvelé le débat sur la bonne gouvernance. Il est clair que, et toutes les récentes études en la matière le montrent, la mixité est à l'origine d'une meilleure intelligence collective, produisant des solutions plus innovantes et par conséquent des entreprises qui affichent de meilleurs rendements financiers. Et pourtant, les femmes continuent de faire face à des défis systémiques en matière d'accès à des postes de gouvernance et de leadership. Alors, une première question tout d'abord, que vous inspire cette très belle thématique?
Can you hear me? Okay, perfect. Good morning, everybody. Thank you very much for having us here today. So I'll take off my headphones in the meantime. I think this theme is very important because it touches on all elements of our lives. Whether we're talking from home to the development of our countries in Africa, globally as well, and to the sustainability of our businesses. An article was recently published by the New York Times where it talks about how the world is becoming more African. And right now, when you look at the percentage of the population in Africa, you have more than 50% of, about 60% of those are classified as youth. More than 50% of those are young women. And what does that mean? That means you need to ensure that you're creating opportunities for these young women not just for them to be productive members of society, but for them to be able to contribute to the development of our countries. And I think what's very interesting when we talk about women driving change, you talk about gender parity, somebody put it best saying that it's like flying a plane with just one wing. And for the longest time, that's what a lot of countries have been doing, where we're not really tapping into the potential and the opportunities that women and young women bring to the table. From a business standpoint, I mean, you alluded to it, that researchers showed time and time again that companies that have women as part of their leadership and board tend to be more profitable. I mean, there's a business case for this. This is not something we're just saying. It's the reality. And there are so many factors to that. You have countries that are advancing quicker. We're having this conversation earlier. We're talking about countries that have women who are represented in parliament. And it's not just women being represented, but we're talking about the influence and the opportunities that they have. So I think this is a conversation that's very important, because it's one thing for us to talk about the issues, but it's also for us to talk about the different solutions. What are the challenges that are sort of getting in the way of women being able to contribute the way they're supposed to? What can we do collectively? And I think one of the things we talked about as well was, this is not a man issue or a women issue, it's really a society issue. And how can we address that collectively? And that's why I'm really excited to be here, for us to share our thoughts on some of the challenges and some of the solutions that we're seeing, whether it's in the respective industries we're in or also in our countries as well.
Du programme Moyen-Orient, au Wisdom Center, et vous possédez une expérience de leadership au Moyen-Orient sur des programmes axés sur le développement économique, sur le développement du genre, sur le développement de la gouvernance. Et tout à l'heure, je l'évoquais en introduction, ces problèmes d'inégalité, de pauvreté, d'exclusion qui sont spécifiques aux femmes, finalement, ont une portée mondiale. Et je voudrais qu'on explore avec vous, parce que en Afrique et au Maroc, quand on a envie de faire quelque chose, on sait le faire. Voilà, on a voulu se positionner sur le domaine sportif, on a été capable de se positionner. Je crois que vous avez tous suivi les superbes exploits de notre équipe. Quand on a eu envie de se positionner sur l'automobile, sur l'hydrogène, sur les nouvelles technologies, sur les énergies renouvelables, on a su le faire. Et je crois que finalement, c'est aussi une volonté par le haut, tout d'abord, qu'il faut. Ma question est la suivante. Quelle politique et quelle stratégie, selon vous, se sont avérées efficaces justement pour encourager la participation des femmes dans les postes de direction, dans les processus, je dirais, décisionnels, et finalement toutes les femmes qui aspirent à des postes de gouvernance. Et comment est-ce que ces succès peuvent-ils être reproduits et élargis à l'échelle de notre continent?
Merci beaucoup, Hind, et c'est un plaisir d'être ici. Je vais répondre en anglais. Tu peux m'entendre? Ça va? Okay. So I'll respond in English. Thank you for this opportunity. I think when it comes to women in leadership positions, we've done a lot of research at the Wilson Center looking at women in the public sector in particular, at the executive level, at the legislative level, and in the judiciary. And of course, the numbers are a bit disappointing, even though there is progress made. And this progress is important to highlight, and these stories, these success stories are very important to highlight, to better understand the women's journey from challenge to challenge and then to opportunity and success. These are the stories that not only inspire, but they also give us a bit more data as to how we can have more women in leadership positions in general. There are two aspects to it. There's a legislative aspect, which is very, very important. And that is really a technicality. So that's a technical challenge in the sense that you have a law that has discriminatory components when it comes to men and women. So you tackle the different components of this law, you reform the law, and you change it. But then there's the second component is the adaptive component, and that's where implementing the law is very important. And you need to have mechanisms to ensure that this implementation is taking place. That's where the accountability comes into place. That's where the dialogue and discourse with society takes place. So it is a constant conversation with culture. And culture is not static, because if we're able to evolve our musical preferences, we're able to also evolve our attitudes towards women's place in the family, women's place in the workforce, women's place as political leaders. So it is a journey of change. It takes not only work at the top to change legislation, but it also takes a lot of work from the bottom up at the grassroots level. So we have to see a lot more investment in civil society organizations, not only in women's groups. You know, as my colleague mentioned earlier, this is not a women versus men, this is a societal issue that requires everybody involved. And it's important not only to talk about women's rights in that conversation, but also to tackle masculinity in our societies and how that also adds so much pressure on men and perhaps makes it sometimes difficult, because at the end of the day, it's seen through a power prism. So we have to flip that formula from this is power over to power with. So we come together so that we hold the power together as a unit, men and women, rather than basically this zero-sum game. I have more power. If I give you more power, I will lose that power. So it's a constant conversation at all levels, and that's what succeeded in many parts of the world. We see it also in the Middle East and North Africa region, but it requires persistence and, I'd like to say, strategic patience. Thank you.
Merci, Mérissa Kurma. Je voudrais tout de même préciser que bien qu'un gap important sépare encore le droit et les aspirations d'une partie des femmes africaines en tout cas, je voudrais préciser qu'en ce moment même, un mouvement très important au Maroc, sous l'impulsion de notre roi, Sa Majesté Mohammed VI, que Dieu l'assiste, est en marche et prévoit une réforme globale et profonde du Code de la famille. Et je crois que ça s'applaudit parce que nous sommes en train de vivre des temps très importants pour notre pays. Irène Ochem, je me tourne vers vous. Vous êtes fondatrice et PDG de l'African Women Innovation and Entrepreneurship, une organisation panafricaine primée qui se consacre à favoriser l'inclusion, l'entrepreneuriat, l'autonomisation économique des femmes, justement à travers le soutien et le développement à l'entrepreneuriat. Et moi-même, en tant que directrice d'une école d'enseignement supérieur, je crois fermement au pouvoir de l'éducation. Et je crois au pouvoir de l'éducation non formelle, fondée sur des valeurs qui sont de nature à justement permettre aux femmes de s'épanouir et de développer des aptitudes à diriger. Alors, ma question est la suivante, vous l'imaginez bien, comment ces acteurs de l'éducation et de la formation peuvent-ils eux aussi, à leur tour, contribuer à, je dirais, à l'autonomisation finalement des femmes en tant que leaders?
Thank you very much. Thank you, Amadeus Institute, for calling us once again to Tangier to convene. So, like she mentioned, I lead an organization that works to support women to start and grow profitable and sustainable businesses. So we are talking about women's leadership. We are talking about women's participation in decision-making. My organization, we have chosen to empower women economically because personally, I believe that when you have economic empowerment, then you are in a position as a woman to have a voice and to use your voice. You have agency and you can decide what you want to do with anything that concerns you, whether you want to get into governance, into politics, whether you want to, how far you want to go with yourself, whether you want to get out of an abusive relationship or something that doesn't. Starts with education, yes. Education is key. And there we need to start with the girl child. I know that we are all speaking about this women agenda. People sometimes, some people are even getting tired about hearing us talk about it, but we'll continue to talk about it until it changes. It's about culture. It's a global phenomenon. It's a global challenge. But on the African continent, it is much more enhanced because of culture. cultural barriers, cultural biases, and is systemic. But like Melissa mentioned, culture is a dynamic thing. It can't change, and it's gradual. It will take time. So this is why we'll continue to have these conversations until, we see the needle start to shift. It's shifting in many different ways, but it's not enough. So it starts with education, the education of the girl child. I know that in many societies, African societies, girls don't have equal opportunity to education as the boys. There are still I happen to have been fortunate. I was raised by a widowed mother, and I was the only girl out of 5 children. And my mother, because she was widowed so early in her life, understood the importance of economically empowering her girl child. And it was important for her that I went to school. I went to the right schools. I got quality education. And that is why I am able today to be sitting here. That is why I am inspired to do what with different stakeholders to implement design solutions to support women to start and grow and scale profitable businesses. And we have loads and loads, hundreds and hundreds of impact stories. And this is why it's not just a conversation. There is a business case to it. The women that we are working with, more than 5,000 women that have directly accessed skills, entrepreneurial education, and skills building. And they are out there building businesses, scaling those businesses, employing people, creating jobs for the communities, contributing to Africa's economic growth, to Africa's GDP, and building communities. So why wouldn't we support the inclusion of women in the economy and in leadership and in governance? It makes sense. It works for everyone. So education is key. And when we talk about education, we also have to talk about STEM education. Getting girls at that early stage to get into science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. That's what you call STEM, because technology is driving everything in the world now. And that is also where the money is. So why not have women get equal opportunity there? I'll stop here. Yes, okay, thank you.
Je vous remercie, Irène, et j'avais promis tout à l'heure en introduction que ce panel serait aussi l'occasion de partager des idées inspirantes. Il est vrai que, et j'en profite pour remercier en votre nom à toutes, mesdames, l'Institut Amadeus, et à travers lui son président, c'est Ibrahim Fassifiri, pour cette opportunité de discuter ensemble de thématiques qui sont importantes. Et tout à l'heure, quand nous étions en train de discuter, je disais que je suis née il y a 35 ans et que j'ai l'impression que je me dis, il est où le game changer? À quel moment? C'est très bien tout ce qu'on est en train de dire, mais je pense que, et vous l'avez dit Irène, ces femmes, elles ont aussi besoin d'avoir une voix. J'aimerais juste, si vous me permettez, revenir vers Bémisola Boudou. Vous n'êtes pas encore présenté. Je voudrais préciser que vous êtes entrepreneur accompli, chef d'entreprise, experte en marketing de luxe et activiste sociale. Vous êtes vice-présidente, écoutez-moi bien, vice-présidente et chef de pays de la NBA Africa. Et en 2022, vous avez été reconnue par Sports Illustrated comme l'une des femmes noires les plus influentes du monde du sport. Je crois que ça s'applaudit. C'est une fierté. Alors, ma question, elle est simple. Et je vois plein de jeunes filles, je crois aussi quelques étudiantes, je vois beaucoup de femmes qui sont venues nous écouter et je les en remercie. Concrètement, quelles sont vos recommandations, vous qui êtes une femme d'influence? Quelles sont vos recommandations pour les jeunes femmes qui aspirent justement à des postes de leadership? Est-ce qu'on va le leur donner ou est-ce qu'elles devront aller se battre pour les avoir? Et puis, tout à l'heure, on en a discuté. Est-ce qu'il faut compter sur les hommes? Est-ce qu'il ne faut pas compter sur eux? Est-ce que c'est une question d'éducation? Je sais que je pose beaucoup de questions en une, mais j'entends un peu je vous entends d'ici et je crois qu'on partage toutes ensemble un sentiment de frustration. Alors, quelles sont vos recommandations d'abord, vous qui êtes une femme d'influence?
Thank you very much for that. Sorry, getting used to taking on the headphones on and off. Thank you very much for that. Honestly, I'll probably say the number one thing that you need to do, and I always say this, is you have to be bold. Honestly, you have to be bold. The way the world has been set up, and that's why I started out by saying it's a societal problem, not just a man versus woman thing. It really is, we've all grown up in certain schools supposed to act. And I think it's very important that sort of taking that, and I say taking that power back and taking that ownership back. First, I would say, and it would be amiss if I don't say, I truly believe that every society in the world really needs to teach unconscious bias. In schools, in the workplace, because understanding what this unconscious bias is really going back to saying we've all been trained a certain way. As women, we've been told to show up a certain way. For men to understand that they've also been trained a certain way about how life is supposed to be. And if we don't acknowledge those biases, a lot of these problems will continue to persist, because the reality is it all starts from the home. We were talking about this earlier. You don't get to the workplace and because you've put on your suit, your unconscious bias stops the moment you put on your suit. It exists when you get to the workplace. The way you view your female colleagues, the way you engage with your female colleagues, both men and women, it really has been determined from the way you grew up at home. So I think it's very important that this is taught in schools and is taught in the workplace. Then back to the young women, I would say number one, honestly be bold. Be very, very unafraid to pursue your goals. Understand that there are certain words you're going to be called. And I say this because I had to learn this from a very young age. There are certain words you're going to be called because if you show up in a world where you don't conform to what people have been told a woman is supposed to be, get used to those words and let them lose their power over you. Whether it's being called difficult, whatever the word is going to be, get comfortable with those words, because once you do, it loses its power over you and it allows you to show up in the way you want to show up. I would say that's number one. Number two, really understand self. I think these are all basic things, but really because it all starts with you. If you believe and you really understand yourself and what your contribution to in the workplace or at home, wherever you show up, the reality is the way you show up is determined by that. I always say find allies and sponsors. When I say allies in the workplace, there's a lot of performative allyship going on right now. It's when you say you're someone's allied. Allied is a verb, not a noun. It's really showing up and really, it's in your everyday engagement with people. That means that if you're a man and you see somebody using a wrong language or sexism in the workplace, you see somebody shutting a woman up while she's speaking in the workplace, because that happens a lot, it's being unafraid to tell your colleague, don't do that. That's being an allied. Being an allied is not saying that I believe in a woman should have equal rights in the workplace as a man. That doesn't mean anything. It comes down to your everyday action and how you do that. For women, I always say that it's very important for you to understand the political landscape of your workplace or the political landscape of school. Meaning you need to know who are the right people you need to develop relationships with and people who you need to align yourself with. A sponsor is someone who's going to be in rooms you don't have the capacity to be in rooms in, but the person can speak on your behalf. The reality is no matter how hard you work in the workplace, your work alone is not going to speak for itself. It's not. The reality is, and I always say this to young women, and I even say more so if you're an African woman, a woman of color, you're going to have to work 2 to 3 times as hard as your male counterpart. It's just the reality. But I don't see that as a problem. I see it as an advantage. Why? Because that means whenever I show up anywhere, I know I'm going to be 10 times as prepared as the next person, because I don't have the luxury of not being prepared. I don't have the luxury of making a mistake. So you take that disadvantage and use it as an advantage, because that means no matter where you show up, you always show up in the best capacity possible. You're unafraid to challenge status quo. And one thing I love, I think it's really important to say this, it's what the power of sports presents. I always say that working for the NBA, the organization is one of those organizations that identifies that sports is one of the most powerful tools in the world. It's one of the most powerful tools in the world. Why? Because whether it's from a physiological standpoint, whether it's from a mental standpoint, from a developmental standpoint, country branding, business development, there's so many things you can do with sports. And what we're doing, I would say in Nigeria and in Africa as a whole, is being able to harness that. Why am I saying that when I give young women advice? It's very important to participate in sports. Why? Because you develop life skills that will stay with you for the rest of your life. People don't realize this. Research shows time and time again that young women and young boys who participate in sports outperform their counterparts that don't. Why? Because when you play sports at a young age, you learn team coordination. You learn how to play with people, and you learn how to work well with people. You learn how to fail. That is so important. You know that whenever you play sports, you're not always winning, but you also learn how to fail at a young age. Critical thinking, communication skills, these are all life skills that you learn from playing sports. With the MBA, one of the things we've done is that we have our junior MBA programs for the youth, and we've been very, very deliberate and very intentional to ensure that these life skills are built into the curriculum. So in Nigeria, for example, we've modified the curriculum in Nigeria so that the skills that are deficient in society are reflected in this curriculum. We saw that as a gap for it. And I think finally, I would say with young women, my main advice and look at it for the positive, that if you look at the world that it's not designed in your favor, that means for every obstacle you encounter, it doesn't derail you, it doesn't demoralize you, you expect it as part of the process. And you're willing to confront it, you're willing to speak up. And I say this to a lot of, with young women, but I see a lot of older professional women here as well. Society has been designed in a way that makes it possible for us to be to be afraid to speak when we see things that work against us. And the only way things can change is for those of us who are in positions and who have a seat at the table to be willing to fight and be willing to speak up for it. So that would be my advice. I've said for young women, but I would say for women who are here as well, where you currently have a seat at the table, it's your responsibility to the younger generation that you have to speak up and you have to fight. And the reality is, yes, it might work against you, but in the long run, you will shift the needle for the next generation like other generations have done for us as well.
Merci beaucoup. Je voyais que Hajar avait envie de peut-être intervenir. Je voudrais vous faire rebondir dans ce... Et tout à l'heure, on a eu le plaisir d'échanger là-dessus. C'est vrai qu'aujourd'hui, il y a un dogme, il y a un poids de la religion, il y a un poids des valeurs. C'est difficile aujourd'hui d'être confronté à aussi, je dirais, cette vision patriarcale sur notre continent. Je voudrais juste rapidement, Hajar, te faire rebondir sur l'intervention de Bemisola. Et je voudrais surtout préciser que vous êtes représentante jeunesse des Nations Unies pour les Pays-Bas. Vous avez travaillé sur des thématiques clés liées aux droits de l'homme, à la sécurité, mais aussi à des problématiques liées à la crise climatique. Et vous militez pour une plus grande participation de la jeunesse au processus décisionnel. Alors, ma question est la suivante, justement. Tout d'abord, comment induire ces changements culturels? Parce que c'est important pour moi. Comment les induire? Des changements culturels, structurels, profonds. Et puis, comment peut-être les médias, eux aussi, peuvent-ils participer à ce changement? Tout à l'heure, vous avez toutes évoqué l'importance d'avoir une voix. Et je ne sais pas ce que vous en pensez, mais on voit pas beaucoup de femmes qui sont des chefs d'entreprise. Moi, je viens aussi pour partager un sentiment de frustration. Je trouve que cette génération, notre génération, ces jeunes femmes, il n'y en a pas beaucoup qui sont justement des role models. Il en manque, que ce soit au Maroc, que ce soit en Afrique. Et je crois qu'il est temps aussi que notre génération, ces millennials qui sont en train de s'apprêter à occuper, je l'espère, des postes importants, mais aussi à être des visages dans la vie publique, il faut qu'elles soient capables de pouvoir être des porte-paroles de ces femmes qui ne rêvent que d'une chose et qui n'aspirent qu'à une chose, c'est celle d'occuper des postes de responsabilité et de gouvernance. Alors, c'est un peu long ce que je dis, mais Hajar, ma question, tout d'abord, comment réagir et que faire face à ces changements structurels qui s'imposent à nous et à ces changements culturels?
Yes, well, thank you so much. I think, Hind, you saw me listening to Bemisola, and I couldn't keep my excitement in as she was speaking, because you spoke also about the fact, and I think that's so fundamental to this, right? That we stand so much on the shoulders of those that came before us. I mean, Hind, you started off by mentioning, my God, we've been speaking about this for so long, and yet we're still here having this panel all together. And what has changed? I think on the one hand, there is something to be said about so much appreciation about all those that have come before us and done so much. But I think, and that's also something that I focus on in the work that I do, there's a lot that can still be done to actually get women, young people into positions of decision-making power. Now, you mentioned it already. I had a mandate for 2 years in the Netherlands as the youth representative to the United Nations. So I'm Moroccan originally, but born and raised in the Netherlands. But that was one experience that really gave me a lot of insights into what it means to come into places where representation really still needs to be achieved. So I recall the first time that I was at the UN, walking in, and I thought, okay, here you have this big shot international organization supposed to represent the world, right? And you mentioned it, Bemisola, more than 50% of the world is under the age of 30. Well, I walked in there, I was 19 back then, and my God, it was so old. It was rusty and dusty. And when you were looking at the people that were seated at the places where the interventions were being made, where resolutions were being negotiated about topics that would affect our future, there wasn't a young person in sight. So something that I learned there is you have allies. You mentioned the importance of allies, and I second that. It's so important. But what I also really saw while I was there were some people within the UN institution, within the Dutch government, but also other governments, and they were very keen on bringing those young voices in, which was great. But then the consequence was that we were super dependent on the goodwill of others to make sure that we were included into these decisions of decision-making. And I mean, so much grace and so much admiration for the people that take the extra leap of faith, and they reel either women in or young people. But the thing here is that then you're dependent on the goodwill of a policymaker or somebody from the ministry or somewhere else to be included. That is not structural inclusion, because as soon as somebody takes office that doesn't have that goodwill, you lose your seat at the table. So what I learned early on is that something much more fundamental and structural is needed to make sure that we're heard. And that is why I started my organization.
Exactement.
I co-founded it. Yes.
C'est parfait. Vous me faites ma transition. You are the co-founder of Network 2100, à travers laquelle vous essayez de rendre le processus de prise de décision plus inclusif. Pouvez-vous nous en parler? Comment faites-vous cela?
Yeah. Absolutely, yeah. So that indeed, I founded it, I think, 3 years ago with a couple of colleagues of mine. But that was because of sort of that experience I had at the United Nations, where I thought there's something much more needed. So what we do with 2100, maybe just briefly, is we try to get young people, young women also especially, into boardrooms. So it's an intergenerational network. Half of our network exists out of young people, and the other half consists of corporate leaders, so executives, political leaders, and we sort of work together to bring a new voice into those rooms. And it's so needed, because once you're in a boardroom, or if you have a political position, then it's structural and you're not dependent on that goodwill anymore to be heard. And what we see, I mean, in the Netherlands, for example, if I take it there, we have an old boys network. We have men that are in these positions of power, and it doesn't have to be sinister. That is the thing that I also liked about what you said about unconscious bias. Very often, I mean, I guess there is a group that might be consciously blocking women from entering here, but the majority of the people, they only invite others in that look like them, that are like them. And I mean, it's a very human, psychologically, it's a very natural thing. We invite people in that look like us. But what happens if the majority of the people in these boardrooms are, well, if I take the Netherlands, older white males that sort of hold the power a lot? It means that they're going to reel in other men, and then women are left out, young people are left out, indigenous voices are left out. So what we need there is to first off reel those women in. That's why it's an intergenerational network, because the executives that are a part of our network, they sort of, they're very transformative, and they acknowledge the need to change. So that's bonding with your allies and getting people in. But the second thing, and that is maybe my final point that I want to add here, is it's so crucial that we are very critical of how our systems are structured. Now, that sounds very abstract. What do I mean with that? Again, if I take the Netherlands as an example, the supervisory boards that we have for big corporations, and these are very influential places, they appoint themselves. So let's say we'd be a supervisory board in the Netherlands. All 7 of us here on stage, or all 6. And one of us is, hint, your mandate is done, so a new position is open. What happens in the Netherlands, and it's the case in many countries all over the world, is that it's structured in the way that the other people that remain in the board, they get together and they decide who the new person will be. Now imagine that these are all men, for example, older men. What happens? The 7th male gets appointed, and we keep women out of these structures, and that's how you maintain an all boys network. So the reason I'm mentioning this is oftentimes, yes, we need more finance. We need to encourage women entrepreneurialism. Yes, we need to also look at ourselves individually and what we can do, but nothing will change unless we also start with looking at the structures and how they're formed. Because this example that I'm giving is a prime example of how we maintain sort of like generalistic, same sort of group people that are in charge, and you would actually need to broaden that and start with the rules and sort of the system structure around it.
Merci beaucoup, Hajar. Merci pour elle. Hajar, tu me rappelles une phrase de Michelle Obama qui disait très simplement, quand il n'y a pas de place pour vous à table, ramenez une chaise. Et c'est vraiment tout le principe du go get it. Voilà, c'est vraiment important pour moi. Je te remercie, Hajar, pour ces réponses qui nous donnent à réfléchir. Foumi, je me tourne vers vous et on parle avec Hajar aussi d'intelligence collective. Finalement, ce sont des intelligences collectives qui devront être ce levier, je dirais, essentiel à cette montée en efficacité, à cette montée en puissance du leadership féminin inclusif et diversifié. Et en parlant d'intelligence, de récentes études soulignent justement que ces intelligences collectives ne correspondent pas, ou plutôt ne dépendent pas des intelligences individuelles des membres, c'est-à-dire au sigma des QI de chacun de ces membres. En revanche, elles dépendent fortement de la proportion de femmes dans le groupe qui est justement fortement corrélée à leur capacité d'écoute et à leur sensibilité sociale. En vérité, l'hypothèse n'est pas de dire que le pouvoir est exercé différemment par les femmes, ni même potentiellement mieux. Et ça, ce n'est pas à moi de le dire. Par contre, il est clair que c'est la mixité qui favorise un exercice du pouvoir différent. Alors, ma question est la suivante, Foumi. Je voudrais aussi qu'on parle de cette nécessité que l'entreprise aussi prenne part à cette danse vertueuse. Parce qu'on a parlé avec Mérissa de ces politiques qui doivent être inclusives. On a parlé de stratégie d'empowerment. Et je crois qu'aussi, ce monde qui est changeant, il revient à l'entreprise aussi d'accompagner et d'anticiper le changement. Alors, en quoi la diversité au sein des organes de gouvernance peut-elle améliorer la prise de décision et la performance organisationnelle? Finalement, comment est-ce que l'entreprise aussi devra participer à cette ronde vertueuse pour la femme?
Thank you so much for that question, and thank you once again, everyone, for having me on this panel. Yeah, talking about what is going on right now, or what everyone on this board has been talking about, I want to just put some statistics, additional statistics out there, because in my own work, I work with SMEs and financial advisory, business incubation, and fund management. And when you are dealing in this environment, you get to meet a lot of women that are working in that space. It's believed that all over the world, about 40% of SMEs are actually owned by women. And in Africa, you have about 58% of the self-employed population of Africa to be women. I come from Nigeria, and Nigeria has the highest number of female entrepreneurs all over the world. Over 23 million SMEs are owned by women from Nigeria. I also work a lot in the agri space, and you find out that more than 50% of smallholder farmers are actually women. But you know, it's very interesting to find out that these women do not really have access to own land. A lot of time, because of inheritance issues, they don't have land. and it becomes difficult for them to be able to grow. I work in the fund management space, and less than 10% of fund managers in Africa are actually women. So when you look at all these figures, you find out that women are already at a disadvantage. And we also grew up in a society that sort of, like everyone has been talking about, we have this unconscious bias. And it's so deep that a lot of times people just expect you to be quiet or to behave in a particular way. And therefore you have this bias that, sort of becomes acceptable even in the minds of the people that are being discriminated against. Unconsciously, you begin to accept that that's the right way things should be done. A young lady said to me one time that she doesn't want to grow her career because she's afraid that if she grows her career, then she's not going to have a family, because her mom told her that if she's too successful professionally, she's not going to have a husband. And that has been said to me severally before I got married, that I already had one certification and I wanted to do another one. And one of my sister-in-laws said to me, "Who is going to marry you?" So when you have this kind of a society, or you have this kind, and this is very prevalent in Africa, and particularly sub-Saharan Africa, where I come from. So it becomes something that we all need to work, towards, to actually put better positions out there for women. So like Bemisola said, the first step is you as a woman believing in yourself that you can achieve. I had to say to one lady at one time, you can have it all. You can have a very good career. You can have a good home. You can have your kids. You just have to decide what it is that you want for yourself and work towards that. It doesn't have to be what the next woman wants. Everyone just has to be able to make up their own mind. Then the society has to be something that will be constructively done and intentional. We have to be intentional about it. And I think this kind of a panel or discussion are the kind of things that we need, because we need to be able to understand the fact that the bias out there makes it very easy to leave the women off the table and to take decisions and to have that self-confidence and be able to hold yourself and understand the fact that you don't have a problem with yourself. I had an experience recently. I was added to a cohort of women in an incubation accelerator program for fund managers. And we were all women, we're 25 women in that acceleration program. It's still going on right now. And my kids asked me, "Mommy, how is the program going?" We had a 2-day physical program before we did the rest, started the red virtually. And I told them, friends, and I say, "Oh, I need to travel to the US. I have a meeting." They feel like you are always traveling. You are always on the road. And I don't think they say that to men that travel as much as I do. But because I'm a woman, the society expects me to be at home, to sit down, even though I have kids already in the university. They still expect that I should be at home and not necessarily leave the house. So when I met these women and we were talking, I realized that, oh, I'm not strange. I'm very normal. I have a tribe. So I say to every woman out there that is trying to achieve something, find your tribe. Your tribe is out there and you can actually do quite well. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup. J'aimerais peut-être vous faire rebondir, Mérissa. Finalement, la question aujourd'hui, c'est qu'est-ce qu'on peut faire ensemble pour mieux réussir? Et qu'en est-il de la place de l'homme?
First of all, I just wanted to comment on something very important that Fumi touched upon with regards to the agro sector and how many of the women farmers do not own land. And I want to zoom into this, asset ownership and unequal inheritance component, because I think, this touches the lives of so many women in our part of the world, in the Middle East and North Africa region in particular. But from a research perspective as well, it was very interesting that in the flagship report that we published at the Wilson Center that focused on women in leadership positions in the public sector, one of the predictors of women's leadership in the public sector was actually asset ownership and equal inheritance. Because with that, and we wanted to understand more about that, with that, women, if it's not available, if it's unequal, women don't have financial independence. If you don't own assets, then you don't have collateral. You cannot go to a bank and ask for a loan because this is what the financial sector is expecting you to provide. And then the barriers continue. Of course, some of them are attitudinal, behavioral, and sociocultural, but it really does stem from how it is enshrined in the way that inheritance is set up. And of course, you can go to many governments in the region, and I've had these conversations with many government officials. Well, yes, it's on paper, but it's not always implemented. Well, it is implemented, and it affects so many people across the region, and particularly women and and families as well. And so it is a hot potato issue because this is enshrined in Islamic jurisprudence and Sharia, but it's a conversation that has to be had with religious leaders, with political leaders. If we don't move forward with this conversation, this will continue to be a binding constraint. If this is unlocked, many other components are unlocked as well. And other research entrepreneurs who have made it to Forbes Middle East and have been on the cover of magazines were all women who actually inherited funds, who had the means to start their own business, but also help other women in their networks. And so this is a very crucial component of working at the top level, but also at the grassroots level to tackle. This is really should be a priority to work on from a policy perspective. And going back to we've heard this from my other colleagues on this panel. It is a work in progress, and it really cannot stop with just one achievement or one person appointed to this board or one success story. It has to continue. Talking about it has to continue in the media, in the public sphere, making these stories available and accessible. Social media platforms are a great platform for many women to be able to exercise voice. You mentioned the importance of tapping into that, to highlighting these people's stories. And so it's true that we continue to have these panels, but I hope that we continue to have these panels even when we as a global community close the gender gap, because it's very important to maintain these stories for generations to come, because we've seen how you can make so much progress, take 10 steps forward, but then there will be forces that could push back. We've seen these ebbs and flows in progress across the world. So we need to continue the conversation, even if we manage in 50, 70, 100 years' time to close the gender gap once and for all. Thank you.
Merci, merci beaucoup. Bien sûr, vous voulez rebondir.
So I think something that's very important, because whenever this conversation are had, right, a lot of times it's us women talking about this, right? And I think it's very important that going forward, because going back to this is not a women issue, this is a society problem.
Absolutely.
And I think it's very important that men who are allies need to step up and be part of this conversation, because seeing them as part of the conversation and them being examples of seeing what they are doing, also, it's important for men to hear from them, because what ends up happening is when it's just us women speaking about our experience, about what we see, then it continues to be just a society problem that men are included in the discussion. They're part of the audience. Then I truly believe that also impacts, because I think their male counterparts would hear them more and would be able to be more receptive to what they're saying and what they're doing, versus when it's us constantly saying, here's what we believe you need to do to help us in shifting that needle.
Irène, vous voulez rebondir dans ce sens?
Yes, yes. I would like to add a bit to that. It is actually very, very important that in conversation, economic sense to do that. But I also want to point out that on the continent, we have achieved some progress. Let us not undermine the progress that has been achieved so far. It is very slow, but it is encouraging. We have a country on the continent that leads the world in women leadership, in governance, and also in business, and that is Rwanda. And that's where I am coming from. I just flew in from Kigali last week, where we had our conference, the 9th edition of our conference, all the way to this place to continue that conversation. And in Rwanda, for example, we are seeing the impact, the results. We have, this is a country that leads the world in women's leadership in governance. 63% of Rwandan cabinet is women. And it's a country that is doing well economically and socially and everything. You have women leading critical institutions, economic and government institutions, and it's working. So that's exemplary. You come to South Africa, that's another African country that is intentional about women's participation in governance. So we have to, even where necessary, have affirmative action, to drive this agenda forward. There is Namibia, there is Egypt, where I had my conference last year, and I saw a lot of women in business, leading businesses, really, really powerful women leading businesses and organizations. So we are making progress, but there is a lot more to be done. And the conversations, we need to involve men. We need to involve government. I think it is more a problem of policy. There is nothing that we can do without the right policies, mainstreaming gender, so that we can close those gaps. We have gaps, across everything, across sectors, across in accessing finance. Without finance, if you are in business, you can't do much. Without access to education, skills, you can't do much. Without access to the right networks for you to connect and interact and, just do like the men, you can't do much. And without access to the right enabling opportunities and the environment, you can't do much. But I believe that this is one of the challenges that the continent has, and as soon as we are able to shift that needle, I think Africa will start to see more economic and social development. During COVID, when everybody was thrown into something that nobody ever imagined would happen, we saw in different areas where women took the lead. In health, it was more women in the hospitals, abandoning their children, abandoning their homes, managing homes. It was women. In education, women went back to the homes, working with children, losing their jobs and losing their businesses. Where they still had jobs, they were managing that and then making sure that the families are working, children are still schooling in whatever means. So when we empower women, we all stand to gain. So why are we afraid to do it? We should not be afraid. We should not feel threatened, because in the long term, in the long run, it will be to everybody's benefit.
Yeah. Maybe if we can have a round of applause indeed for Irene. I wanted to add to that, because I think there were some things mentioned, and thank you also for doing that, because indeed I think it's so important that we take it out of this sort of like silo of only women discussing this, because indeed it is a society-wide issue, and it's an issue of inclusion and participation. I wanted to add, I think the role of education really cannot be underestimated, and you see it in a way, because it is changing gradually, and you see a new generation that does really look at this differently. I mean, we're not there yet, but there's a big difference. I see a lot of young people in the room. Do we have Gen Z in the room? Can I see everyone born after 1995? Okay, I see them. Oh, some more over there. But see, this is sort of like the new generation, and they're coming to these places. They're being shaped by both how we're being raised at home, but especially through education. That is like the place where you can have like a common sort of conversation about which values are important. How do we use that? How can we better use that? I think that that's an important one. And I want to add one more dimension to this, because indeed when we say this is a society-wide issue, that is true. It's not just a women's issue, but I also think that these discussions, we often have them in silo. I just want to emphasize how important it is to speak about gender impact and imbalances also within the field of other issues. So I do a lot of work in climate, for example. My God, if you look at climate, if you just, for example, take incurring droughts that we see as a consequence of the climate crisis, it's mostly women that are being affected by the consequences of that. If we look at in Africa, it's mostly women that are responsible for carrying drinking water back home. And now the droughts are so severe and so heavy that it takes them so long to get to the nearest sort of well or the nearest drinking water point, that by the time that they get back, young girls and young women, they don't have the opportunity to follow education anymore. There's no time left in the day to go to school. That has a big, severe impact on them. And on the other hand, you see that, other women that might have had the opportunity to have their own micro business or to have something on the side that can get them some financial independence, that chance is being taken away from them. And all these issues, they're being exacerbated by issues like the climate crisis, like conflicts, like droughts, like food shortages that are all interlinked in that way. So when we talk about the impact of women, it's in leadership, yes, it's in governance, but it's in conversations about conflict zones. It's about conversations about the climate crisis, and that element is so crucial to make.
Alors, je pense que tout le monde a envie de... Allez-y, je vous en prie, Fumi, si vous voulez bien peut-être rebondir dans ce sens.
Sorry, I'll be very fast. Right, yeah, so there was one of the conversations we had before we came out here was about, still on the issue of education, but talking about the families, about the future. So when we're talking about educating the future, the future generation, it's about changing the narrative where we make the male child feel that there are some roles that you have to perform, and the male and the female child, these are your own roles and you need to stay on your lane. I think if we're going to have the kind of change that we want to see, the way we train our children, the future has to change. Because even some women are the ones that are training, their men, their boys to have these biases. So we need to change from the home front. We need to begin to train the children culture in Africa. Yeah, we have different cultures across Africa, but I think there are some things or some areas where we are very common and very the same. There's so much pressure put on the male child about providing for the family, and the girl child is made to believe, okay, you're just supposed to take care of the family and that's all. I think if we want to see the kind of change that we are looking for, some of those narratives need to begin to change so that the male child, as he's growing, instructions from me, while the female child must also be seen to, made to understand the fact that if you have the ability to actually create wealth, you need to also be able to help in, providing for the family. Once we're able to break down some of these stereotypes, then it becomes easier for the genders to relate in a more humane and unbiased manner that will engender the kind of discussions we're trying to have. Thank you so much, Indy.
Merci beaucoup. Mérissa, vous vouliez également rebondir dans ce sens?
Yeah, I wanted to follow up on the education point, and this is very much in line with what also Fumi and Hajar mentioned. So, of course, access to education is important, inclusive education is important. It's important to look at the quality of education and how the gender issues are framed in the curricula. I am a native of Jordan, And I can tell you that some of the textbooks specific careers, and also condition men to take specific careers. So for example, there in conversations in the text, and there has been analysis of the curricula from on this. There are discussions about men and women having the right to work, fantastic. And then you have pictures, and the pictures are women teachers, women nurses, male doctors, male engineers. That automatically socially conditions young girls to go into specific sectors, the so-called feminine sectors. And when we look at the government makeups, in various cabinets, very rarely in our region do we see women ministers of the economy, ministers of the industry, or ministers of security, defense, or foreign policy. They are ministers of social development, of culture, of education, of tourism. Those are important sectors, but they are not the sectors with the most decision-making power or the largest budgets. So just look at how these pictures in one textbook can actually be reflected years later at the cabinet level. And that's how powerful images are, powerful education is. So that's absolutely a must to work on these levels as well.
Merci beaucoup, Mérissa Kurma. Il est clair que il y a des défis majeurs aujourd'hui qui sont adressés à notre continent et je crois sincèrement que l'Afrique a rendez-vous avec son histoire. Tout à l'heure, Ajar parlait de changement climatique et à vrai dire, et là je me tourne vers Bémi Sola, nous le savons, il n'y aura pas de développement sans sécurité et nous savons il n'y aura pas de sécurité sans développement et nous savons il n'y aura pas durablement ni sécurité, ni développement sans égalité homme-femme. Et je voudrais qu'on prenne un peu de hauteur parce que je parlais tout à l'heure en introduction de superposition des conflits géopolitiques, sociaux, sociétaux, et en même temps, il y a des forces vives qui agissent et il sera vital pour nos sociétés de les saisir, je dirais. Alors, dans ce contexte africain, et puisque nous sommes dans une plateforme d'échange des pays sud-sud, comment ensemble, mais cette fois-ci, je parle des nations, comment les pays du Sud, ensemble, peuvent-ils collaborer pour adresser ces enjeux majeurs que sont notamment le développement durable et la justice sociale, tout en promouvant un leadership féminin et inclusif?
Thank you very much for that question. I think that's, considering where the world is at the moment, that's a very relevant question. And I think the answer to that really stems in what we've all said, honestly, where this is everybody coming together and figuring out a way to resolve the problems at hand. I think, Melissa, you sort of alluded to it when you talked about the education, and it's sort of taking the, I would say, taking it a step further, where it's looking at everything through the lens of gender mainstreaming. I say gender mainstreaming, it's so important because it really addresses the issue of unconscious bias that I mentioned earlier. And I'll give an example of that and sort of builds to the question you just asked. One thing a lot of people don't realize, research was conducted about 15 years ago to understand why 50% of young women stop playing sports at the age of 17. And when you look at it surface level, you just say, oh, they hit puberty and they stop playing sports. But the reality is, let's take the sports of basketball, for example. When we looked into it to understand why young women stop playing sports and stop playing basketball, is the way basketball courts are structured, majority of them did not have changing room for young girls. So that means for young boys, they can get on the court and just put on their jersey and start playing, whereas young women could not do that when they get to a certain age. And what does that mean? That means when you're in a certain position, like I would say in the position that I'm in now, it's like when we're constructing basketball courts, we have to ensure that you put changing rooms there. And if you don't look at it through the lens of gender mainstreaming, people would just think men would not think about that. And they're not thinking about it because they don't want young women to play sports. It's just a matter of it's not the first thing or the primary thing that they would think of, whereas for a woman, you go to the court, the first question you're going to ask is, where can I change? So that and this applies, even take it to the workspace as well, where you have a lot of companies that used to have, they call it like their training classes, let's say after 6, 7 p.m. And they would wonder why majority of the people there were men, not women. And you realize that because at that point, there's the second work, unofficial second work that women do, which is taking care of the family. So that means they have to leave work at a certain time to make sure they can pick up the kids from the daycare and they can prepare dinner. At that point, that means that women cannot be in those classes. And it takes companies sort of taking a step back and saying, okay, not just men prefer to do this versus women. It's saying, why don't we have women there, and how do you address that issue? And I use it as an example because honestly, it applies to everything happening in the world today, which is why going back to the importance of that being very intentional and very deliberate about ensuring that, and you made a very good point, because no matter what conversations we have, it has to be a systematic change. If the system doesn't change, the outcome, it will continue to be an uphill battle. But the reality, like we talked earlier, majority of those people making that decision right now are men, which is why that whole importance of getting men to become allies, but at the same time, it's while we're educating them and telling them about the importance for them to make these decisions that impact us right now, to the point Fumi made is how are we raising our sons right now so that they're being sent to a different school of thought than their fathers did, or they're going to a different school of thought than we did. So honestly, just conflict resolution, no matter where, it really comes down to everybody coming together, everyone sort of coming from a place of how do we really resolve this problem? It's not from a self-interest standpoint, it's from a humanity interest, all right? And that's why even going back to, if we say it's a humanity problem, then we all come together to solve it. Same thing with the gender problem. If we see it as just one person's problem, then it's just gonna be women who continue to talk about it. Whereas if we collectively see it as, this is a problem that's affecting society, it's affecting development. I mean, McKinsey recently published a report that said that Africa could contribute 316 billion to our collective GDP by 2050 if women were more included in decision making, and that makes sense. It's going to impact the development of the society, it's going to impact the sustainability of the society. Same thing with businesses. If you don't include women, you don't have women in decision-making position, because it's very clear. I mean, I think it's really worth stating, and Irene, you mentioned this, that in this report where it talks about women matters, Africa is definitely performing better than other parts of the world when it comes to having women in senior leadership positions. But the flip side to that, you now say, is that are they in positions where they can enact influence? So looking beyond the numbers, like what is the numbers saying and what the influence is? So when we look at it as a collective problem that affects the development of society, affects the advancement of society, then we all know that we come together and we have to find the resolution. And whatever conflict that is, we have to come together to really resolve it, where I have to remove myself from it and say, what's the greater good for humanity? You know?
Merci beaucoup. Je pense qu'il y a beaucoup de questions dans la salle. Peut-être juste pour conclure, Hajar, avec vous, je disais que vous êtes vous étiez représentante jeunesse des Nations Unies, et le changement dont parle Bemisola, c'est un changement qu'il appartiendra aussi à la jeunesse d'entreprendre. Et je crois que les statistiques sont très claires. Vous savez qu'aujourd'hui, sur notre continent, nous avons la population la plus jeune du monde. Et je vous parle de 400 millions d'habitants qui sont âgés entre 15 et 35 ans. Quelle formidable source d'énergie, quelle formidable opportunité justement d'induire et de construire ce changement ensemble. Alors, j'aimerais finir sur un message d'espoir, Hajar, parce que, et comme l'a très justement dit Irène, il y a aussi des choses qu'on fait et qu'on sait très très bien faire en Afrique. Alors, un message d'espoir, Hajar. Quelle vision avez-vous pour un avenir où les femmes jouent un rôle moteur dans le développement et dans le changement? Et finalement, qu'est-ce qui serait nécessaire pour encourager un leadership féminin à l'échelle mondiale?
Yes, thank you. What an honor, by the way, Hind. You're giving me the final closing for hope and everything, so no pressure on me right here. Can I also start with saying so many hopeful things I think have been shared. I think number one is inclusion, and I think you really reiterated, Misola, also the importance of it. Now, I wanna challenge us a little bit, because I think inclusion, it's so vital, and I mean there are countless researches and like studies and surveys that we can cite and that we can quote that really show it. The more diverse a board is, the more better the outcomes economically, but also societally, environmentally. Decisions just get better. So if we have underrepresentation of women, then we just know that we're not like living up to the standard that we could be living up to. But that is including sort of like almost gender equity, if I would say, through inclusion. But there's a whole different way in which we can do it as well, which is by looking at the system that we're operating in. So we've been talking about education as well. I'm 23, I still study, I'm a business student, and I just wanted to share a story with you, because I remember that I was at the UN Climate Action Summit, which was focused on how we can get more ambitious sort of climate action in New York in 2019. And I remember that I was at this conference during the day, and I was talking to political leaders, I was talking to business leaders to really plead for more sustainable actions and more climate ambitious sort of metrics that need to be implemented. And then in the evening, when I got back to my hotel room, I had my big fat accounting book for an exam that I had to take when I would get back to the Netherlands. Now, usually when you mention accountancy, people walk out the room because everyone thinks it's boring, and I know it has the impression of being boring, but hear me out, this is actually really interesting. When we look at the rules of the game, of the economy that we operate in, inclusion and gender inclusion is not a metric, amongst other things, that we sort of like analyze and assess companies on the basis of. I mean, there is one thing that is king in the world of economy, and it's financial value. I don't have to tell you that because you know it. But what was interesting to me during that conference is that during the day I was pleading for a new sort of economy, and then at night I was taking my book and I was teaching myself the way of the old economy. So if we take a profit and loss statement of a company, for example, and you look at the costs that companies have to pay, they are only financial costs. The atmosphere, there is no accountability for diversity, for inclusion, for how accessible and open-minded organizations are. There's nothing about living wages that aren't paid, of which women are disproportionately more the victim for underpayment. And this is where I want to get to you. This is the point that I really want to mention. We need inclusion, but we also need to take the rules of our economic game and change it. I mean, we need a new freaking accountancy standard that makes it mandatory for corporations to pay for their climate costs. You have to pay up for deforestation, for toxins that you release into the atmosphere, as well as you should be reporting on how diverse, how inclusive your organization is, because it is only when we do that and when we embed it into our economy that actual change actually happens. And that is what structurality for me means at its core. It's about structural inclusion, yes, of people in boardrooms, in places of decision making, but just as much, if not more, in the policies that we have and in the rules that we structure. Hind, I love that you quoted Michelle Obama earlier. I had another quote that came to mind when Fumi was speaking, and when you were talking about, you know, how this is a wide issue, and it's actually almost human interplay. We have females, we have males, and it's really about how can we sort of get them to see that it benefits everyone if we have more equality amongst ourselves. I think it was Emma Watson, the girl that plays in Harry Potter, for those of you that don't know. And she is an ambassador for this organization. It's called He for She. And I think she says it so eloquently, because she says, if we can change the culture in all our societies, because let's be real, this is a global issue at its core as well. If we can change a culture in which men would not feel obliged to be dominant in order to adhere to societal standards, then as a consequence, we would also have a society. Thank you all so much for being here, because I also always say, and I do mean that, I'm not just saying it, but the presence of each and every one of you in this room here underlines the importance to this topic and this issue that is being felt. And can I just also say, because Hind, you are so giving to us, but I also want to ask for a round of applause for Hind, because the work that you do is so admirable. within the world of education and everything. So thank you also for that, because you're a role model in that regard.
Thank you so much. Merci beaucoup à toutes. Je crois qu'il y a beaucoup de questions dans la salle. Ces femmes sont absolument inspirantes. Elles sont des modèles, et je pense qu'il y a beaucoup de jeunes filles dans la salle qui se posent des questions. Comment un jour devenir aussi une femme influente comme Bemi Sola? Comment un jour peut-être avoir une voix, donner une voix? Mérissa, vous qui êtes américaine, qui avez vécu un peu dans le Moyen-Orient aussi, qui possédait une expérience de leadership qui vous permet aujourd'hui d'être un de ces porte-drapeaux. Fumi, vous qui êtes aussi nigérienne, vous habitez en Afrique du Sud, et tout à l'heure je disais que l'Afrique du Sud est un des premiers pays, est un des, je dirais même des 4 pays sur 10 dans le monde à avoir, je veux dire en termes de représentativité de femmes dans le Parlement. Donc alors peut-être la parole dans la salle. Est-ce qu'il y a des micros dans la salle? D'accord. On va peut-être commencer devant, si vous voulez bien vous lever, et nous, on vous écoute. Merci beaucoup.
Bonjour à toutes. C'est un plaisir d'avoir écouté les différentes participantes. C'était très édifiant. J'ai une question concernant le gap entre les femmes seniors et les femmes plus jeunes, et la difficulté du fait que parfois les femmes seniors sont tellement occupées que à faire vraiment du mentorat proche et pratique semble impossible. Donc nous, les femmes qui sont un peu plus jeunes, comment bridge the gap, comment dépasser ce blocage-là et vraiment bénéficier de l'expérience des femmes plus âgées? Merci.
Merci beaucoup. C'est une question sur l'importance, la nécessité du parrainage, du réseautage et du mentorat. Il est vrai que c'est une question très importante. Peut-être, Bemi Sola, si vous voulez réagir là-dessus.
I think that's a great question about mentorship. I mean, I would say I'm a classic example of someone who I've had so many amazing women and men pour into my life, all right? And I fundamentally always say it takes a village to raise anyone. And in terms of mentorship, I think you have to seek out mentors, to be honest. I think it's a two-way street. But when I say seek out mentors, you're not just seeking out mentors and expecting people to just pour into your life. You have to be valuable to your mentor as well. So it's that two-way relationship, mentor relationship. I always give a classic example, and I even think it's even more relevant in the world we are today. That makes it so much easier. So when I was in business school, which was about 15 years ago, I'm aging myself by saying that, there was a particular commercial by Dove. Everyone knows, I don't know if you know the Dove company, like body wash soap. Their first campaign about like real women. I was so, as a marketer, I'm a trained marketer by training. I was so blown away by the campaign. And as somebody who's inquisitive by nature, I wanted to know who was behind the campaign. I did my research and I found out that an executive at a communication/marketing agency was behind it. You know what I did? I was so blown away by it that I decided that I was going to reach out to this person. This is about 15 years ago. It's not, you don't have like, social media wasn't what it is today then, where everybody's technically accessible today compared to then. So I drafted an email. I was in business school, drafted an email and just saying how blown away I was by the campaign, and I would love to speak to her. This was before I did my country branding work in Jordan, which sort of set the tone for me knowing what I wanted to do next. At this point, this was my first year of business school. I wasn't quite clear what I was going to do after business school. So I drafted and I said I would love to talk to her. I would love to get 15 to 30 minutes of her time, and potentially I would like to work for her. If you know most company emails, there's only so much combination that you can have for a company email. I think max you have 5 combination. It's first initial of the name, last name, at the name of the company.com, whatever. I sent this email with the different combinations to her, and within 24 hours, I got a response from her. And you know what she said? She said, if someone is going to take the time to write an email like this to me, that person deserves a response. I got an interview. I interviewed with her and ended up not working for her, ended up working for Louis Vuitton after business school instead. But my point of saying that is, if there's anybody you see out there that's doing amazing work, if there's anybody out there that you feel like you can connect with them, because that connection matters as well, I think the best thing you can do is the onus is on you to seek the person out. the onus is on you that even if they don't respond the first time, most executives are extremely busy. You get an person to pay attention to you, for you to set up a time. Take the time, sit down and write a really good email. There's power in writing. I'm really big on professional writing. If you're not good at professional writing, go take a class on professional writing and learn how to write properly. Send an email and connect with the person, and the onus is on you for you to ensure that the person takes the time to really get to know you. But then when you get that opportunity, it's a two-way relationship. There's so many things in your position that you know that I don't know. There really is. There's so much value you can add to my profession. There's so much value you can add to me. And it's you being able to figure that out from the conversation, that beyond what I'm pouring into you and what I'm sharing with you, it's also you finding a way for you to pour into me as well. And you know what happens? Then it goes from being a mentor-mentee relationship to actually just being a friendship. And I always say, for the goal of any mentor-mentee relationship, for me personally, some people don't necessarily feel that way, but for me, my goal is always, how do I take my mentor-mentee relationship and let it graduate to become a friendship? So it's not necessarily as formal as it would in the beginning, that it becomes something where the person has a vested interest in my success and I have a vested interest in their success.
Merci beaucoup. Je crois que tout à l'heure, vous avez parlé de travail. Maintenant, vous nous parlez d'audace, de persévérance. Je crois que le leadership, la gouvernance, c'est quelque chose de viscéral. Quand on a envie d'y arriver, quel que soit le chemin que vous empruntez, c'est-à-dire que quand je dis que c'est viscéral, on se réveille en pensant à ça, on mange en pensant à ça, on dort en pensant à ça. Et en général, il n'y a absolument rien qui ne devrait vous limiter dans vos objectifs et dans vos passions. Voilà. Peut-être une autre question dans la salle. Mademoiselle, je vous en prie, allez-y. Irène.
Bien. Bonjour mesdames, en fait je suis ingénieure en informatique en herbe de l'école d'innovation et d'ingénierie INSI. Alors tout d'abord permettez-moi de vous remercier infiniment pour d'être ici aujourd'hui et pour votre travail acharné et votre dévouement dans la création de cet événement. En fait, en tant que des femmes, on est très fiers de vous et très fiers d'être ici avec vous. Alors ma question c'est que quelles sont les recommandations et les conseils pourriez-vous me donner qu'un jour, je puisse être à votre place et avec vous, because I'm truly passionate.
Yes, I would say that already as an engineer, you know, and a woman engineer, you are already, you know, in the same places where we are speaking from. So you are already there, and you are one of those role models. You know, we didn't speak much here about role modeling, but so many young girls are looking up to you for being in that technical area, in that technology space where a lot of young girls shy away from. So my thing is, dream big. You know, dream bigger than you have already dreamt before, and work, you know, towards your dream, and they will always become a reality. I am a true example of one. I dream, and you know, and all of us, and you. So yeah, so you are there. You are a role model for other people. We spoke about mentoring in our program. In our programming, as AWIF, we actually build in mentorship into every one of our programs, and it doesn't have anything to do with being a woman or not. In every up to that is mentoring you in that career. So it's all about, it runs across gender. You know, it doesn't have anything to do with being a woman, but of course we know that we have barriers. So I think you are already there, you know, so you just need to keep going and role modeling to other young women.
Can I maybe add to that?
So only sky is the limit, right?
Yeah. Maybe if I just wanted to add one thing, because it also taps to...
Je ne sais pas qui parle, je ne vous vois pas.
Oh, no, sorry, you were wondering if it was there. I just wanted to say, my God, you're an engineer in the field that you're in, and indeed you're a young woman. I think it also taps into what Bemisola said to you earlier, but I think for starters, it's about acknowledging sort of the value that you have. You're extremely talented, probably, because you have to be if you want to be an engineer. But if you know sort of what the value is that you have, that you can also bring it to others. And maybe one thing that I want to add, because I think we're sort of in the same life phase, so I'm thinking about this a lot, but I always think that it's also so fundamental to think about what is it that you're good at, what is it that you enjoy, but what is it also that is needed? Because if the work that you do, if you can sort of align what you like, what's important to you, to what the world needs, then you're already there. And then I would really get into finding allies and partners. And I loved how you used the word friendship, finding people that have the same goals, and maybe they're more senior, and maybe they live in other countries. But if you can unite for like a common goal, then you're going to go so far, and you're going to go so fast at it as well. So I would also think about what sort of like societal issues perhaps you'd like to tackle. You're welcome.
Un message d'espoir et un message de confiance. Peut-être alors, peut-être des hommes. On veut entendre des hommes. Voilà, s'il vous plaît. Monsieur. Et à juste titre, ce n'est qu'ensemble qu'on pourra mieux réussir. Alors, oui, ça nous intéresse de savoir que vous a inspiré cette thématique et les contributions précieuses de nos panélistes.
I would like to thank you, of course, all of you. And I was wondering if one day I can read something like Leadership and Governance, Men Driving Development and Change. That means it will happen one time. I'm with big hope that will maybe as before I die, because you are getting old, and I witnessed some change. Since my mother, I was very young, and my sisters, and my schoolmate, and the society I was living in, and I am still living in, how change is strategies develop till today, until this seminar, when I am missing only one word. There is no room for men in your conversation. We are talking about women, but there is one absent, which is a man, as if we are the guilty. That means we made this situation for you. I wonder what can I do to participate in this change, definitely. But let me share with you just a point of view. I remind myself as a student studying about enlightening. That means this civilization from the West, bringing civilization to Africa or to the Middle East, and strongly believing that they are right, and they should teach the others what they have to do and they have to think. And I also remember how people from these countries were watching these white men and getting a little bit older, I witnessed what means apartheid. And there were other people thinking that these people are the slave of ourselves. And this fight to get freedom out of slavery. And I remember Bob Marley singing, let's liberate ourselves from this mental slavery. So my question for you, are you born women, or are you getting women by the social construct? That means, are you suffering from the way the civilization of humans on Earth is built, and do you want to get free from that? Thank you.
Merci beaucoup. You want to answer to that? Okay, so maybe we could have multiple answers, Merissa and then Fumi, and we could...
Thank you so much for your question and for your comments. I think that there's an element of both. There's an element of women being set up to make everything a lot easier for men and more cumbersome for women. If we want to, and we can zoom into various sectors in various ways. But it's also very much this this mindset that also has to shift. And that's where, and Fumi talked about this earlier, in how we raise our children, how we have conversations with our kids, with our family. Relationships, relations between women to women and men to women. And so there is an element of, it's very much framed in the media sometimes, the fight for women's rights. We are battling. You hear us talk about fighting quite a bit because there is that element. There are barriers there, and we have to surmount these barriers. We have to lift these barriers. But that doesn't mean that we victimize ourselves in this unjust contextual environment. I think agency is so important, and owning who you are as a woman and owning the advantages that you have, being born into this world as a young girl and as a woman, and what that actually brings to the fore, how you contribute to the family, how you contribute to the larger society. So I think part of it is that the onus is on us to have these conversations, but I agree with you completely. The onus is also on us to reach out to you, to men in our lives and in larger society. Middle East and North Africa on feminism and Islamic feminism, feminism in the MENA region, very little research going into masculinity, for example. So in order to understand these dynamics, they're part of one coin. We have to absolutely do a lot more in reaching out, and perhaps next time this panel convenes, there will be men and women on the panel to discuss these issues.
Absolutely. Fumi, la question est très pertinente. Est-ce qu'on est femme ou est-ce qu'on le devient?
Thank you so much. We're born women, and I believe that we should be proud being women. So let me start from my own personal perspective. I'm one of the lucky ones, like Irene said. I was born into a family where I'm the only girl and the last born. We lost my dad at a very young age, and my brothers brought me up as if I was one of them. And so I never experienced, or I never knew what it was to be treated different, because my mom didn't think she was going to have a girl, so she trained her boys as if, if you needed to cook by yourself and all that. So in my family, there were no roles. So I grew up in a very, very liberal setting. But coming into the main world, I see that, and then I was lucky. In marriage, I married someone who appreciates who I am and allows me to really fulfill myself. But what I've found out with time is that I'm actually a minority out there. There are women that grow up in very disadvantaged positions compared to men. So yes, we are born women, and we should be proud to be women. And I don't think that a woman and a man are the same. And I don't think man. I'm not trying to get into that position of a man, no. But I want to be given the opportunity to be the best that I can be. As a woman business owner in Nigeria, sometimes when I'm going into some rooms, I intentionally, based on emotional intelligence, tell my male subordinates to lead the conversation, because I know that when I enter such a room and I try to be the word they will use for me is that I'm aggressive. But if it's a man that is saying those things, they are not aggressive. So I push it on to the men, my subordinates, and say, you lead the conversation. And then they introduce me to soften the, to have a soft landing somehow, and say, this is my boss, you should listen to her. And then when the men introduce me, then it makes it easier for me to be able to talk in such rooms. So what I'm saying is that it shouldn't be, or what I would say is that it shouldn't be that way. A woman should be able to talk or should have a seat at the table if she has what to say and she has a capacity. She doesn't have to channel herself through a man for her to be able to make conversation at a table that she has the technical knowledge to be able to do. I was sharing with the other ladies before we came out here about a lady that had worked with me before as a maid. And when she got married, she sort of gave, she didn't have an account of her own bank account, and everything was done through her husband. At the end of the day, she was still neglected because the man married another wife and then started neglecting her. When she reached out to me, she was quite bitter. And the first thing I told her is, you need to become empowered. Let's not lie to ourselves. The percentage of women that are living in very terrible situations where they are being marginalized and where they do not have access to common human rights is very high. You may not feel so because you are you are enlightened, you have daughters, and you're training your daughters very well, and so you do not think that women are going through this. Women are going through quite a lot. That's the truth. So, but should that lead to a position where it becomes a fight and a struggle between the sexes? I think that will be a problem. I rode from Casablanca to Tanger with a man in the car, and we were talking on our way. The girl child now, and there is nothing being done for the male child because we believe they already have more power than the women, that 50 years down the line, we're going to have to do the same thing again for the boy child. So I think that as we're trying to empower the women, we must ensure that men remain in the conversation and are also carried along, and the male child is also given a place in the world. But let's not get it wrong. There is a lot of disadvantage for women in the world right now. Thank you.
Le micro, s'il vous plaît, peut-être ici devant. Merci Foumi pour ces éléments de réponse.
Hi everyone, Hafsa Zwitny. I am communications and digital marketing and PR manager in NC School. So I am really delighted today to witness all those inspiring stories. Actually, I am delighted to witness your stories, and also I don't want to spot only the negative things. We should celebrate our successes. In our engineering school, if we talk statistically speaking, we have more girls than boys. And in the engineering civil engineers and also management and all field, we have more girls than boys, and they are here. Really, they should have a big applause because they are doing great work. And they are involved in the social work also. We are fighting every day to empower women in all the fields. And really, I like the sports, in climate change, in political field, in entrepreneurship, and all these fields, because really we should spot this and highlight this and really celebrate this. Because, alhamdulillah, in Morocco, since my childhood, since right now, I feel that so many things has changed. So we have witnesses really big changes in all the fields. So we should be happy about it. about it, but also we know that we have so many things to work on and to do in order. I don't like to see fights because we are not in a fight with the men, but we should do things to make things better. For example, I'm going to talk about a Moroccan woman. We need, for example, to have the right to travel with our kids without asking for the authorization of the father. For example, if we want to change the school of our kids, we don't have the right of the father to change the school, for example. There are small things.
Je rappelle que ce sont des choses qui vont changer avec la nouvelle Moudouana et nous en sommes très très fiers.
We have to applaud this. Really, we are so happy to be Moroccan and Arabic and Muslim, and we are living. We are doing all the things that men can do today. So big applause for us. We are the best. Thank you.
Il est vrai que le Maroc a fait des pas vraiment de géants en termes en tout cas, le code de la famille qui est en train d'être révisé. Et puis, bien entendu, qu'il ne suffit pas de faire passer une loi. Il faut aussi que un sentiment de frustration. Il y a tout de même des choses qui ont changé. Mais il va falloir que les mentalités aussi changent avec. Vous savez, de temps en temps, et Madame a donné cet exemple de anciennement, mais les choses sont en train de changer, où les femmes, dans un certain nombre de pays arabes, parfois ne peuvent pas, après un divorce, voyager avec leurs enfants sans avoir un accord du père. Ça, ce sont des choses qui doivent absolument changer. Ça n'a pas de sens. Et le pire, c'est que précédemment, lorsque ces femmes-là allaient demander, allaient contester au niveau des juges, les juges étaient eux-mêmes des hommes qui n'acceptaient pas parce qu'ils n'avaient pas les mentalités requises. Et donc, c'est réellement un changement structurel. C'est un changement structurel que nous devons. Exactement, exactement. Moi, je suis moi-même fille d'une femme juge et j'en suis très fière. Et ce sont ces femmes-là qui sont des juges, des pilotes, des ingénieurs, des écrivaines, parce qu'on a besoin aussi d'avoir des femmes écrivains, des femmes qui promeuvent la lecture, la littérature. Vous avez parlé du théâtre, vous avez parlé de l'art. Et on a parlé tout à l'heure aussi avec Foumi de cet impératif de l'éducation en tant que levier essentiel pour permettre aux femmes de développer leurs aptitudes à diriger, à s'ouvrir au monde, à être autonomes, à avoir envie. Cette envie viscérale d'entreprendre, elle est importante pour moi, ou en tout cas d'être un leader. Alors, on voudrait entendre plus d'hommes, s'il vous plaît, monsieur.
Hey everyone, I'm Mohammed from Tangier. I can ask you especially about the United States one. What difference do you see between women here in Morocco and the women there in your country, in the United States of America? And thank you.
In the United States, the difference? I mean, you know, there's a lot of data, of course, that we constantly look at. So, starting with, I think, access to education, Morocco has done so much to ensure that the gender gap in education is closed. You know, we've heard from our colleague in the audience about how there are more women in STEM than there are men. Across the Middle East and North Africa region, this is a trend that there are more women outperforming the male counterparts in tertiary education in universities than men. And that's, I think, very surprising to many people in the United States because there's a knowledge gap about some of these issues. But I think where there are differences is this education actually transferring to women's participation in the workforce? So in the United States, it's about 48% to 50%. COVID actually impacted a lot more women than men in the United States. At a given year, I think all the jobs that were lost in that year, I think that was the second year of COVID, were actually women losing jobs. So these dynamics are very similar in North America, in the United States, as they are in the Middle East, and the impact on women science, technology, engineering, etc., than in the Middle East. So there are so many different, I think, aspects to this. But in general, issues pertaining to which we refer to here as the guardianship system that our colleague just mentioned, the right to women to travel independently, the right to women to divorce, the right to women and accessibility for women to just tap into a loan to start their own business. All of these issues are much more facilitated in the United States. And so these systems do not, issues of inheritance, which very much impact women's roles in society and financial independence, as well as families, those issues do not exist because a lot of these issues are not framed, like family law is not framed the same way that it is in the Middle East and North Africa region through religious jurisprudence. And so these make a huge difference in terms of how they impact women's rights and access of women to different issues. But that doesn't mean that the society itself does not have challenges, because it does. I mean, we are yet to see a woman president in the United States. We've had candidates who ran for the presidency but did not make it. And we're yet to see more women representation in Congress. There's huge progress in this regard, but it's nowhere near 50-50. So if we're looking at sort of, the Western world and comparing it to this region, when it comes to representation, I think the average is 30% representation in parliaments in most Western countries, and in our region it's close to 10 to 15. Much exists. I had to rearrange everything in my family setup for me to be able to travel and come to this conference because I have 2 little kids at home. And it's a very different story moving things around if my husband were to also travel. And we are both equal. We're both, working parents. But society looks at things very differently. And I think this is where we have to change the stereotypes, change the conversation. In Africa and in very similarly in the United States and North America in general. Thank you.
On a encore du temps pour poser quelques questions? Encore une dernière question? Allez-y, allez-y.
Hello to everyone. I would like to say that I'm immensely excited to be in the presence of such accomplished and inspiring women that are driving development and change in such different panels of domains. And my question would be, how could us, as a 23-year-old in finance as well, so I totally got how accounting can be boring. I am a finance student in master's, and I would like, as someone who's about to enter the working force, to know how you have navigated in early stages of your careers, going through structures that you want to lead and you want to reach such formal leadership roles as early on as maybe your first job. Thank you.
Bemisola, and then maybe Irene.
So I think that's a great question and a very important question. Honestly, I would say one of the first things is because school prepares you for a certain skill set, and there are certain skill sets that the workplace requires that school doesn't prepare you for. And I always recommend that it's very important that you acquire soft skills. Soft skills they always say hard skills get you the job, soft skills keep you at the job. What are some of the key soft skills that I always say is very, very important? You really be very intentional to acquire those skills in the workplace or before you even get to the workplace. Emotional intelligence. You cannot underestimate the importance of emotional intelligence in the workplace because that would be very crucial in navigating the politics in the workplace. I know I'm one of those people, I always say I don't like workplace politics, but there's no workplace that doesn't have politics, and you have to learn and understand how to navigate the workplace politics of whatever organization you're in. Number two, I always say team coordination. There's a level of intent. I mean, all the skills I'm mentioning, I know if you look at the World Economic Forum's future of work skills, it literally mirrors the same thing because these are skills that are so fundamental that the truth is the educational curriculum right now hasn't caught up. It's just the truth, hasn't caught up and changed fast enough to address the need of today's workplace. So I'll say team coordination skills, critical thinking. These are skills that are so instrumental that I would say whether you find programs, and there are many programs out there now that are designed to ensure that young women especially are able to acquire the skills. Then I would just give a couple of advice that I always say. Number one, you have to stay very open. Because I understand the desire to want to step into an organization and find yourself in a leadership position, but the reality is it doesn't happen overnight. I think for every single one of us here that we talk about our experience, I'm not saying that it has to take as long as it's taking us for you to acquire those skills and to acquire this experience, but I would say also be patient with yourself to understand that there are certain fundamental skills that are required for you to gain and experience you have to acquire before you can find yourself per se in, I would say, a leadership position like we are. When you're starting out your career, some people might not agree with and not as important in the beginning. I placed more emphasis on getting the right experience, working within the right organization, getting the right foundation than I did on making sure that I was being paid for it. That meant that I took jobs. I mean, when I did an internship with Disney for 6 months, I really didn't get paid to do that. But the reality is that set the background and my foundation as a marketer. And that was important to me to get a company like Disney on my resume at that point, then making sure that I was getting paid a hefty salary to acquire those skills. And the final thing I would say is, honestly, don't be too in a rush to move to the next level. This is a universal rule. I mean, I wish I learned this when I was younger. When I was young, I was so ready for the next step. What is the next thing? And you realize that for the rest of your life, there's always going to be a next thing. So really taking that step to this period you're in and this transitional phase you're in, there's so many lessons that you're going to learn that is going to set you up for the rest of your life, and allow yourself to be in that place. Enjoy it, learn from it, because guess what? Whatever problems you're encountering right now, and we all do in whatever phase we're in, there's going to be bigger problems and more problems in the next. Enjoy that learning process as well. Enjoy that process of trying to figure out what life has for you, because guess what? You're never going to have this phase and this period in your life again. Once it's gone, it's gone. A next set of problems presents itself.
Une dernière question peut-être pour Fumi. Allez-y. Pour Irène, pardon.
Merci. Je tiens à remercier vivement les panélistes. Vraiment, vous mettiez d'une grande valeur ajoutée aujourd'hui. Madame Fatem Zahra Fassali, je suis acteur associative. Juste pour vous dire qu'à l'âge de 58 ans, j'ai réussi à avoir un doctorat. Et vous dire aussi, revenir à l'idée de mentor. Un mentor, il ne peut c'est pas forcément quelqu'un qui est plus âgé que nous, mais moi, dans mon parcours de doctorat, j'ai réussi à avoir des mentors plus jeunes que moi, qui ont l'âge de mes enfants, de ma fille surtout, et chaque fois, ils étaient là pour moi. Juste pour vous dire, plus âgé que vous, et vous m'avez vraiment inspiré aujourd'hui. Et j'ai vraiment une question à vous poser, et peut-être, quel message vous pouvez passer à des femmes comme moi, qui ont l'âge plus que vous, c'est-à-dire à notre vieil âge, si vous permettez, et de dire quel message autre qu'on peut passer à ces femmes-là pour leur dire qu'il n'y a pas d'âge pour être leadership, qu'il n'y a pas d'âge pour être dans des podiums pour vous, et pour vous dire aussi que j'ai une grande tentation, que je suis en train de me faire et d'essayer de me réaliser dedans pour être une modératrice demain. Et au même podium, je ne vais pas dire je vais vous remplacer ou bien à votre place, mais au même podium peut-être que Madame Hind, au même podium que toutes les panélistes aujourd'hui qui sont avec nous. Et voilà, je vous demande, s'il vous plaît, quel message autre que vous pouvez passer à ces femmes-là. Merci beaucoup.
Merci beaucoup. D'abord, vous pouvez être très très fiers de vous et vous êtes absolument la preuve qu'il n'y a pas d'âge pour réussir surtout. Donc vraiment, bravo pour la persévérance. Irène, qu'avez-vous à répondre à cette jeune femme? Vous êtes jeune, madame, il n'y a pas d'âge. Il n'y a pas d'âge pour étudier, pour réussir.
I think there is no response here, actually. This is a woman. Yeah, he responded to himself. You have a PhD. We are mentorship doesn't have to be an older person mentoring a younger person. I get my mentorship, from the businesses, the startups, the young emerging entrepreneurs that we are working with on a daily basis. They don't even know that they are mentoring me. They believe I'm the only person mentoring them. But I get more value out of them. I learn a lot continuously every day. So mentorship is also just maybe observing somebody that you to give back, to mentor other women. So I can only say my compliments to you, and yeah.
Merci beaucoup, Irène. Foumi, le mot de la fin.
And may I add, maybe in your time, I don't know whether you have a LinkedIn profile. Do you have a LinkedIn profile, for example? LinkedIn.
Est-ce que vous avez un profil sur LinkedIn?
You do. So make sure that you actually put the things that you've done there. Populate it very well, because you may be very busy and so you're not really positioning yourself very well. So as a professor that you are already, you have your PhD, you should be on the panel. So you have what it takes already, but if you do not showcase yourself properly, the people looking out to call someone like you with so much experience may not actually know that you're there. So you need to get one of your grandchildren or your children to actually help you boost your LinkedIn profile. And you'll be here next year. Thank you.
Can I know you said the last words.
We are actively looking for people like you. But like she said, the world is changing. It's about digitalization. So we have to leverage the digital space to showcase ourselves so that people can find you and, get you involved, because we need people like you.
Il est temps de vous montrer maintenant que vous avez fini votre doctorat. Montrez-vous au monde. Haja.
Yeah, if I can add one final thing, because I think it's so great, and I love what you're doing, and that you also mentioned it. I think maybe one final message before we part ways. I think, the second sentence says it, right? Development and change also. Each and every one of you in this room, we're all working in different fields. Some of you are in education, some are in health, others are doing things with sustainability. You're in investment, the girl that asked the earlier question. I think first and foremost, we should really maybe get together and connect our own career paths a little more with each other. I think there's so much more that we can do if we sort of bring that together. So I get sort of triggered by some inspirational things that I heard earlier when the question was asked, and I think it's so important that we first sort of like define what our why is. What is it that we want to change, and how can we be of service to society? I think it's a whole different ballgame if your career is really sort of a means to an end to create a better world, or to do something for others, or to make the world more sustainable. And if that's your starting point, then you have a very strong why. I think if you start there, and if you find others that share that same goal and you then move forward together, there is so much more that you can do. So homework for everyone that's here. When you leave today, find people that are in the same field, find people with aligned goals, and make sure that you sort of move together and find a common mission to work for. Because then I think all these obstacles, they'll be also much easier to bear all together. That's one final.
Beaucoup de questions à explorer ensemble et je suis ravie de voir que cette thématique a réellement suscité l'intérêt de votre audience. Je voudrais vous remercier à vous qui avez porté de l'intérêt pour nous, pour nos magnifiques panélistes. Merci à vous. Je voudrais vous remercier, mesdames, d'être venues d'un peu partout dans le monde pour participer à ce très beau panel. Je voudrais vous remercier pour vos contributions précieuses. J'espère qu'on aura l'occasion peut-être pas de nous revoir et puis de voir aussi un peu d'accompagner ce changement en espérant que les choses continuent à changer grâce à vous qui avez eu la riche idée de préparer votre doctorat à 56 ou 57 ans, à toi Hajar qui a 23 ans et qui a envie de faire partie de ce changement. À chacune d'entre vous, je voudrais vous remercier personnellement, vous m'avez beaucoup inspiré et à très bientôt.
Et merci à vous, Hind. Vous êtes magnifique, merci.
Merci à vous et peut-être une photo.